You should notice some similarities from last week's reading, second Sunday of Advent in Year B. We've got to focus on the mission and the ministry of John the Baptist. Although here we're getting the Gospel of John's account of the Baptist mission. And so there's a few elements of it that are unique to John that we want to highlight. First and foremost, just the mission and identity of John the Baptist. Notice how John begins here, St. John the Evangelist. The evangelist begins by saying that this man who was named John was sent from God in order to bear witness to the light. So this is going to be a constant theme in John's Gospel, that Jesus is not just the Messiah, he's not just the Savior, he's not just the Lord or the King of Israel, he is the light of the world. And so John the Baptist's mission is to be somebody who bears witness to the light. The Greek word for bear witness is martyreo. We get the word martyr from that. So John is going to be, in a real sense, the first Christian martyr, insofar as he's going to die for bearing witness to Christ, the Messiah. Another element here, notice that John tells us that John the Baptist, was not the light, but came to bear witness to the light. Now, why does he have to say that? Why does he have to say that John the Baptist wasn't the light? Well, the reason is because John was an extremely popular Jewish figure. He was an extremely popular Jewish prophet. If you read, for example, the writings of Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, Josephus mentions John the Baptist and he mentions Jesus, but he gives a lot more attention to John the Baptist, creating the impression, and some scholars have suggested this, that in some ways John was even more popular and widely known than Jesus was. He was certainly a less controversial figure in the sense that he was widely accepted by his Jewish contemporaries as someone who was sent from God, who had a message from God. Right, so John was extremely popular. And so St. John the Evangelist here is having to make clear to us that John himself is not the Messiah, but rather just his precursor, just his forerunner. Because some Jews actually were wondering if John was, in fact, the Messiah, which leads us into the next part of the Gospel, the question of John's identity. Right? So what happens here is some Jews have been sent from Jerusalem, priests and Levites, in other words, leaders of the community, to ask him exactly who he is. And notice that John denies three potential identities. First, they ask him, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm not the Christ." Now, when you see the word Christ there, it's really important to stress that the Greek word is Christos. It just means anointed one. It's a title, not a name. So although we tend to use the word Christ as if it were Jesus' last name, that's not how it would have been utilized in the first century. So what the Baptist is literally saying here is, I am not the anointed one. So strike one. He's not the King of Israel that everyone's been waiting for, which some people probably thought. Second, he also says that he is not Elijah. What's that about? Well, if you look back at the book of Malachi, chapters 3 and 4, there's this prophecy that says that God is going to send Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So the Jews, based on that prophecy from Malachi, had developed the expectation that before the Messiah would come, at the time of salvation, Elijah would have to come first. Okay? So when John the Baptist appears on the scene, and he's clearly a prophet speaking from God, and he even dresses, in a sense, kind of acts like Elijah. He lives out in the wilderness. He wears a garment made out of camel's hair, like Elijah had dressed. Some people say, aha, he must be Elijah. And so they ask him, are you Elijah? And he says, no, I'm not. We'll come back to that in a minute, because that's the controversial part. Third dimension here, you might miss it, but it's really important. They ask him if he's the prophet. Now notice this. They don't just say, are you a prophet? Everyone recognized that. What they say is, are you the prophet? Definite article. Ho prophetes in Greek. And so the prophet in a first century Jewish context wasn't just anybody. It was a reference to Deuteronomy 18 and the prophecy of the prophet like Moses. Before the Israelites went into the promised land, Moses in the book of Deuteronomy says to them, the Lord your God will raise up for you and from among you a prophet like me, and he will speak to you, right? And you will listen to him. So the expectation developed that one day there would be this prophet like Moses who would come. And sometimes he was even associated with the Messiah himself. The Messiah was seen as the new Moses. I get into this in my book, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist, where we look at Jesus as the new Moses. So effectively, what the Levites and priests are asking John the Baptist here is, are you the new Moses? Are you the prophet like Moses? Then again, strike three, nope, I'm not the new Moses as well. So who are you, John? Well, here John identifies himself. He basically says, I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight a path for our God. In other words, I am the one who was spoken of by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 40. Now, we looked at this prophecy in detail last week for the second Sunday of Advent. And we looked at how Isaiah had prophesied a new Exodus and this messenger who would come and who would act as a herald to proclaim that God himself was coming in order to save his people, to proclaim the coming of the new Exodus. So this is a very important text because in the Gospel of Mark, Mark lets you know that John the Baptist was the one that Isaiah had spoken of. But in John's Gospel, John the Baptist himself identifies himself as the figure from Isaiah chapter 40, the forerunner of God, the herald of God, the prophet of the new Exodus. So that's how John the Baptist identifies himself in this passage as well. Now, when the Pharisees hear this response, their immediate question then to him is, well, wait a second, then why are you baptizing? If you're not the new Moses, if you're not Elijah, if you're not the Messiah, then you shouldn't be baptizing. Now pause here. What does that mean? Well, this is something we frequently forget, as if you're a contemporary Christian, you might not realize that baptism was a part of Judaism at the time of Jesus, insofar as they practiced ritual bathing. So this was particularly prominent in Jerusalem around the temple. Before you were able to enter into the temple, you had to be ritually pure, you had to be ritually clean, which would mean you would not only have to prepare yourself through prayer and fasting perhaps, but that you would also have to wash yourself in ritually pure water, as the book of Numbers describes in Numbers chapter 9. So they would have these ritual baths called mikvaot, the singular is mikvah, around Jerusalem, and Jews would go down into the mikvah, they would wash, they would be immersed, and the Greek word for immersion in water is baptizo, right? So they would in a sense be baptized in order to go in and encounter God in the temple, in worship, in offering sacrifice. Now, John the Baptist then brings people out into the desert, and he's baptizing them, he's washing them, not just for ritual purity, but for the forgiveness of their sins. And the priests and Levites are basically saying, hold on a second. If you're not the new Moses, if you're not the new Elijah, if you're not the Messiah, by what authority do you do this, right? Because usually ritual preparations like this would be something that would happen in the temple. You have to be a priest, right? You'd have to have some kind of authority. And so what John answers them by pointing away from himself into Christ. And he says, I'm just baptizing with water, but among you stands one whom you do not know, he who comes after me, whose sandal I'm not worthy to untie. So he points them to the fact that the one who is really going to cleanse is going to be the Messiah himself. The one who is coming after him is far greater than John himself. You see the image there, once again, just like in Mark's gospel, of not being able, or not being worthy, I should say, to untie his sandals. Well, what does that mean? Well, untying someone's sandals was the task of a slave, right? So if a master would come home from a long journey, what would the slave do? The slave would untie his sandals and wash his feet. That was one of the tasks of a slave. That's why when Jesus washes the feet of the disciples later on in John's gospel, the disciples, in particular Peter, they freak out, right? They're astonished and they recoil at the thought of Jesus washing their feet because he's basically saying, I am your slave. Well, John the Baptist here is saying, the one who's coming after me, I don't even have enough authority in a sense to be his slave, to untie his shoes. That's how much greater he is than I. All right. So clearly here, John is testifying that he's not the one. He's not the one everybody's been waiting for. He's not the one who is to come. He's not Moses. He's not Elijah. He's not the Messiah. He's just a forerunner. He's just a predecessor.